I've never been good at noticing when things begin. The moments that matter most seem to slip past unmarked, disguised as ordinary Tuesday mornings or the space between one breath and the next. But I remember the exact weight of my backpack that day, how the strap had worn a groove into my shoulder blade, and the way the campus bus wheezed to a stop in front of the library steps. I was 20 then, caught in that strange liminal space between adolescence and whatever comes after. My life moved in careful patterns. Early morning shifts at the campus bookstore, afternoon lectures in sterile classrooms, evening study sessions that stretched until my eyes burned. I liked the predictability of it. There was safety in being unremarkable, in sliding through days without leaving fingerprints on anything that mattered. The bus was already half full when I climbed aboard, fishing quarters from my jacket pocket while students pressed past me in the narrow aisle. I had claimed the same seat for months now, third row back, window side, where I could watch the world blur past without having to acknowledge the lives unfolding around me. My earbuds were already in place before I sat down, a barrier between myself and the low hum of morning conversations. That's when he appeared. Not appeared, exactly. That makes it sound too dramatic, too much like the kind of story where fate intervenes with violins and soft lighting. He simply walked down the aisle and dropped into the seat beside me with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, as if the empty space had been waiting for him all along. I didn't look up from my phone, but I felt the shift in the air when he settled in. The faint scent of coffee and something clean, maybe soap or laundry detergent. The rustle of fabric as he adjusted his jacket. And then the quiet shock of contact, his knee brushing against mine as the bus lurched forward. Neither of us moved away. I should have. That would have been normal, expected. A polite inch of distance to acknowledge that we were strangers sharing necessity, not choice. But something in that accidental touch felt deliberate, worth preserving. So I stayed exactly where I was, my leg warm where it met his, pretending to scroll through messages I'd already read while hyper-aware of every breath he took beside me. The bus followed its familiar route through campus, past the student union with its clusters of early risers clutching coffee cups, past the engineering building where maintenance crews were already hosing down the sidewalks, past the oak grove where I sometimes ate lunch alone when the weather was kind. I knew every stop, every turn, the precise moment when the driver would hit the brakes too hard and send everyone swaying forward in unison. But that morning, the routine felt different, charged with possibility I couldn't name. I found myself stealing glances at my seatmate through the reflection in the window. He was maybe a year older than me, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and olive skin that suggested afternoons spent somewhere sunnier than the Pacific Northwest. There was something inherently watchable about him, the way he hummed quietly under his breath and tapped complex rhythms against his thigh, like he carried music with him wherever he went. He wore a faded band t-shirt under an unbuttoned flannel, jeans with paint stains on the knees, and beat-up Converse that had seen better years. A sketchbook peeked out of his messenger bag, its cover worn soft at the edges. Everything about him seemed to exist in comfortable contradiction, careful and careless, present and distant, like he'd mastered the art of being exactly where he needed to be without trying too hard. As the bus filled with more passengers at each stop, I waited for him to relocate. There were other empty seats scattered throughout, places where he could spread out without having to navigate the complicated geography of shared space. But he stayed put, occasionally shifting to accommodate his long legs, but never moving away from that point of contact between us. By the time we reached the main campus loop, I had begun to construct small theories about him. Art student, obviously based on the sketchbook and paint stains. Probably lived off campus, maybe in one of those converted houses near the park where rent was cheap and walls were thin. Someone who stayed up too late and survived on coffee and whatever optimism he could scrape together between morning classes and evening shifts at some job that barely paid enough to matter. The bus slowed as we approached my stop. I gathered my backpack, preparing for the familiar choreography of excusing myself past him when he stood first. Not to let me out, but to leave himself. We walked down the aisle single file, his shoulder just ahead of mine, and stepped off onto the same patch of concrete. For a moment, we stood there in the morning light, two strangers who had shared 30 minutes and 3 square feet of vinyl seating. I thought he might say something then, acknowledge what had just happened in whatever small way people do. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his bag, gave me a brief nod that might have been a smile, and walked toward the art building. I watched him go until he disappeared around a corner, already knowing I would spend the rest of the day thinking about the weight of him beside me and wondering if it had meant anything at all. That night, as I tried to focus on reading assignments and failed spectacularly, I told myself it was coincidence. Campus buses ran on schedules, students followed routines, and sometimes people just ended up in the same place at the same time without it signifying anything deeper than proximity and timing. But when I woke the next morning, I found myself choosing my clothes more carefully than usual, taking an extra moment with my hair, arriving at the bus stop 3 minutes earlier than necessary, scanning faces in the small crowd of waiting students until I spotted him jogging across the quad, messenger bag bouncing against his hip as he hurried to catch the arriving bus. He climbed aboard just as the doors started to close, slightly breathless and grinning at his own timing. And when his eyes found mine through the crush of morning commuters, when he worked his way down the aisle and slid into that same seat beside me like it had been reserved with his name on it, I felt something click into place that I hadn't even realized was out of alignment. This time, when our knees touched, it felt less like accident and more like recognition. 3 days passed before I admitted to myself that I was looking forward to the bus rides. My life had always been constructed around the comfort of predictable rhythms. I woke at 6:30 to the same alarm, showered with the same coconut shampoo my mother had been buying me since high school, and ate the same breakfast of instant oatmeal while checking emails I rarely had the energy to answer properly. The bookstore job started at 7:45, which meant restocking returns and processing textbook orders while the rest of campus slowly came alive outside the windows. I liked the early morning quiet, the way sunlight moved across empty shelves and settled into dust motes that danced between philosophy and fiction. There was something soothing about organizing other people's thoughts into neat alphabetical rows, creating order from the chaos of dropped classes and changed majors. I could spend entire shifts without speaking to anyone beyond the necessary transactions, with bleary-eyed students hunting for required reading they should have bought weeks earlier. It was a good life for someone who had learned early that the safest way to move through the world was to take up as little space as possible. I had perfected the art of being pleasant without being memorable, helpful without being noticed. Teachers knew me as the student who turned in assignments on time and sat in the middle rows where participation was expected but not scrutinized. Coworkers saw me as reliable but forgettable, the kind of person who covered shifts without complaint and never caused drama in the break room. But now there was Xavier, disrupting my carefully maintained invisibility with his presence beside me each morning. He was everything I was not. Where I moved through space apologetically, he seemed to occupy it with unconscious ease. His energy preceded him onto the bus. I could sense when he was approaching even before I saw him, something electric in the air that made other passengers look up from their phones and textbooks. He wore his headphones slung around his neck like an invitation, music bleeding out of volumes that should have been annoying but somehow never were. The sketchbook was always with him, its pages filled with fragments I caught glimpses of when he shifted beside me. Architectural details rendered in careful pencil strokes. Profile studies of strangers he must have observed during quiet moments. Abstract patterns that looked like they might be mapping some internal geography I couldn't begin to understand. His hands moved across the paper with the kind of confidence that came from years of practice, creating beauty from blank space while the world rolled past our window. People noticed him in ways they never noticed me. I watched how conversations shifted when he boarded, how other students glanced his way with a curiosity reserved for those who seemed to carry something worth observing. He had the kind of face that invited second looks. Not conventionally handsome, exactly, but alive with the kind of intelligence that made you want to know what he was thinking about. Yet despite all the available attention, Despite seats that opened up throughout our route, he continued choosing the space beside me. It became its own form of routine, this daily ritual of shared proximity. He would board with that easy confidence, scan the bus until his eyes found mine, and work his way down the aisle like he was coming home to something. The way he settled into the seat had evolved from polite necessity to something that felt almost intimate. The automatic adjustment of his messenger bag, the unconscious lean of his shoulder toward mine, the careful arrangement of his long legs, so our knees maintained that initial point of contact. I began to time my breathing to match his during the quieter moments, when conversation died down and the bus filled with the white noise of wheels on asphalt and distant music from other passengers' headphones. There was something meditative about it, this synchronized existence in a space that belonged to neither of us, but had somehow become ours by virtue of repetition and unspoken agreement. The bus route took 43 minutes from beginning to end, winding through residential neighborhoods before cutting across campus to deposit us near our respective buildings. I had memorized every landmark: the coffee shop where baristas worked behind windows fogged with steam, the intersection where construction crews had been laying new pavement for weeks, the park where early joggers traced paths between ancient oak trees. But now I measured the journey differently, not in minutes or stops, but in the weight of Xavier's presence beside me, the way his humming filled the space between us, the occasional brush of his fingers against mine when we both reached for the same armrest. These small intimacies felt enormous in their significance, though I couldn't have articulated why. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was reading intention into coincidence, creating narrative from the simple fact that two people happened to need transportation at the same time each day. But the lie felt thin even as I constructed it, undermined by the way my stomach tightened with anticipation each morning, the way I found myself choosing my clothes with more care than I had in years, the way I lingered at my reflection in bathroom mirrors wondering what Xavier saw when he looked at me. Because he did look at me, not with the casual indifference of strangers sharing public space, but with something that felt like recognition, like he was solving some puzzle I hadn't realized I presented. Sometimes I caught him watching my hands as I turned pages in whatever book I was pretending to read. Other times I felt his attention on my profile when I stared out the window, tracking the familiar landscape that had become the backdrop for this strange new awareness blooming between us. By the end of that first week, the seat beside me felt permanently altered by his presence, shaped by the weight of him in ways that persisted even when he wasn't there. The question came on a Thursday morning when the bus was more crowded than usual, bodies pressed together in reluctant intimacy as we navigated the morning rush. I had been listening to the same song on repeat, something melancholy by the National that matched my mood, when Xavier suddenly shifted beside me. Not away, but closer, leaning in just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder. "What are you always listening to?" he asked, his voice low enough that it felt like a secret shared between us despite the crowd of passengers surrounding our seats. The words hit me like a small shock. After weeks of silence, punctuated only by the occasional polite "excuse me" when one of us needed to leave, the sound of his voice directed at me felt almost intimate. I pulled out one earbud, the absence of music making the world suddenly louder and more immediate. The rumble of the bus engine, conversations bleeding from other seats, the rhythmic thump of wheels over expansion joints in the pavement. I held the earbud out to him without thinking, some instinct overriding the careful social calculations that usually govern my interactions. He took it with fingers that brushed mine briefly, the contact sending electricity up my arm in a way that felt disproportionate to such casual touch. When he pressed it to his ear, his eyes closed for a moment, like he was letting the music wash over him completely. "This is beautiful," he said, and something in his voice suggested he meant more than just the song. Sad, but beautiful, like it understands something about longing that most people are afraid to acknowledge. The observation was so precise, so unexpectedly vulnerable, that I found myself studying his profile as he listened. The slight furrow between his eyebrows, the way his lips moved almost imperceptibly with the melody, the unconscious tapping of his index finger against his thigh. He looked like someone who had spent considerable time thinking about the relationship between beauty and sadness, who had mapped the territory of longing with the same careful attention he brought to his sketches. When he handed the earbud back, our fingers lingered together longer than necessity required. I should have felt self-conscious about the intimacy of sharing something that had been inside my ear, but instead I felt oddly proud, like I had offered him something precious and he had recognized its value. "Your turn," I said, nodding toward the headphones around his neck. The words surprised me with their boldness. He smiled then, the first full smile I had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face from quietly attractive to something that made my breath catch. He untangled his headphones and handed me one side, keeping the other for himself. The wire stretched between us like a bridge, creating a small, enclosed world within the larger chaos of the bus. The music that filled my ear was nothing like what I had expected. Not the indie rock or electronic beats I had imagined, but something acoustic and intimate. A voice I didn't recognize, singing about distance, and homecoming over finger-picked guitar, harmonies layering in ways that felt like conversations between old friends. It was the kind of music you listened to alone in your room when you needed to feel understood, the soundtrack to those moments when the weight of being human felt too much and too wonderful at the same time. We sat like that for the rest of the ride, connected by wire and music, sharing something that felt more personal than anything I had exchanged with another person in months. When songs ended and new ones began, neither of us moved to change anything. We just let the playlist carry us forward, creating its own rhythm parallel to the steady motion of the bus through morning traffic. At one point, a particularly beautiful song came on, something about finding yourself in someone else's eyes, and I felt him glance at me. Not the casual observation I had grown accustomed to, but something more direct, more weighted with intention. When I turned to meet his gaze, he didn't look away. Instead, he held eye contact while the music swelled around us. And in that moment, I understood that whatever was happening between us had moved beyond coincidence into something neither of us had named yet, but both of us recognized. From that morning forward, the bus rides became our daily concert. He would board with a different playlist each day, carefully curated collections that felt like letters he was writing to me in languages made of melody and rhythm. Folk songs that spoke about belonging and displacement. Jazz that turned morning commutes into late-night conversations in smoky rooms. Classical pieces that made the familiar landscape outside our window look like something from a film about beautiful, complicated people living beautiful, complicated lives. I began reciprocating, sharing music that I had never played for another person. Songs that had gotten me through difficult nights, artists who felt like friends I had never met, albums that had soundtracked important moments in my solitary life. Each shared song felt like a small act of faith, a way of saying here is something that matters to me without having to risk the vulnerability of more direct confession. The wire between us became a lifeline, creating intimacy in the midst of public space. Sometimes our knees would press together when the bus took corners, and neither of us would adjust. Sometimes a shoulder would bump mine when he reached for his sketchbook, and the contact would linger just long enough to feel intentional. These small touches began to feel like punctuation marks in an ongoing conversation we were having without words. Other passengers came and went around us, but we had created something separate from their temporary presence, a consistency that felt like the beginning of something I couldn't yet bring myself to define. I started waking up 15 minutes earlier than necessary, not because I needed the extra time, but because I had begun to crave those moments of anticipation before seeing Xavier. I would stand at my bedroom window, with coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the street below for any sign of movement that might be him walking to the bus stop. The waiting had become as important as the arrival, a daily exercise in managed longing that I was still pretending was something else entirely. The music had changed everything between us, transforming our shared silence into a complex vocabulary of songs and glances. Each morning brought a new playlist, carefully constructed collections that felt like Xavier was teaching me something about himself, one track at a time. He favored artists I had never heard of. Indie folk singers who recorded in bedrooms and basements. Jazz musicians who played like they were having conversations with ghosts. Classical pieces that turned mundane bus rides into a scene from films about people whose lives mattered in ways mine never had. I found myself researching the songs after our rides, staying up later than I should have to understand the context he was sharing with me. The folk singer who had written that haunting ballad about distance after her girlfriend moved across the country. The jazz pianist who composed his most beautiful pieces during the months he was falling in love with his longtime collaborator. The string quartet that specialized in arrangements of pop songs, finding classical elegance in melodies originally meant for dance clubs and car radios. Everything Xavier shared seemed to orbit around themes of connection and recognition, like he was building a case for something he couldn't yet say directly. I began curating my own contributions with equal care, selecting songs that spoke to the growing awareness that my life had divided itself into two distinct periods, before Xavier and after. The bus route remained constant, but I had stopped seeing it as transportation and started experiencing it as destination. Those 43 minutes suspended between campus and campus had become the most vivid part of my day, more real than the classes I attended or the shifts I worked or the assignments I completed in the mechanical way I had been completing them for years. When Xavier leaned against my shoulder during the early morning rides, claiming sleepiness as an excuse for contact that felt anything but casual, I would hold perfectly still to avoid disturbing whatever spell we were casting together. He had started bringing 2 cups of coffee on particularly cold mornings, passing me one with the casual generosity of someone who had been buying coffee for 2 people his entire life. The gesture was small enough to explain away, just kindness between regular seatmates, but significant enough to make my chest ache with something I was finally ready to call recognition. The coffee was always exactly how I liked it, though I had never told him how I took it. Somehow he had been paying attention to details I hadn't realized I was sharing. His sketchbook had become a constant presence between us, and I had begun to steal longer glances at his drawings when he worked. The pages were filled with fragments of our shared world rendered in careful detail. The view from our window during different seasons, the hands of passengers holding phones and books and coffee cups, architectural studies of buildings we passed each day. But increasingly, I noticed drawings that looked like they might be me. Never full portraits, just pieces, the curve of my ear when I was listening to music, the line of my shoulder when I was reading, my hands folded in my lap during moments when I thought no one was watching. I should have felt self-conscious about being observed so carefully, but instead I felt seen in a way that was entirely new. Like Xavier was creating a visual record of who I was when I thought I was invisible, finding something worth documenting in moments I had never considered significant. The attention felt like a form of tenderness, a way of saying you matter without risking the vulnerability of more direct language. On mornings when the bus was nearly empty, he would let me look through earlier pages of the sketchbook, pointing out details and explaining techniques with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of someone sharing something they loved. His hands would brush mine as he turned pages, and I would find myself studying the way his fingers moved across the paper, imagining what it would feel like to be drawn by him, to be the subject of that focused attention. The transformation happening between us had begun to spill over into the rest of my life in ways I couldn't ignore. I caught myself humming songs from his playlist during work shifts, letting melodies he had chosen fill the quiet spaces between customers. I started noticing details about the world that I thought he might find interesting. The way morning light fell across the bookstore's front windows, the geometric patterns in the tile work of campus buildings, the expressions on strangers' faces during moments when they thought no one was watching. I was becoming someone who paid attention, someone who looked for beauty in ordinary moments, someone who believed that the small intimacies of daily life might actually matter. It felt like Xavier was teaching me to inhabit my own life more fully, to recognize that even unremarkable people could be worthy of careful observation and gentle attention. But more than that, I was becoming someone who looked forward to tomorrow. Not just the abstract concept of future possibilities, but the specific promise of seeing Xavier again, of sharing another playlist, of existing in that small space we had carved out together, where conversation felt natural and silence felt comfortable, and the distance between friendship and something deeper grew smaller each day. The ache in my chest when he smiled had evolved from confusion to recognition to something approaching certainty, though I still couldn't bring myself to name it directly. The rain came down like forgiveness that evening, washing the campus clean of another day's accumulated exhaustion. I had stayed late at the library, not because I needed to study, but because I wasn't ready to go home to the silence of my apartment, to the absence of Xavier's voice humming melodies that had become the soundtrack to my days. The bus that carried us back toward the residential neighborhoods was nearly empty, just a handful of students scattered across seats meant for twice as many. Xavier had been quieter than usual during the afternoon ride, his playlist consisting of instrumental pieces that felt contemplative rather than conversational. His sketchbook remained closed on his lap, and he spent most of the journey watching raindrops race each other down the window beside us. I could feel something building in the space between us, a tension that was different from the comfortable anticipation I had grown accustomed to. It felt like standing at the edge of something I couldn't see clearly, waiting for the ground to shift beneath my feet. We had developed our own geography on that bus, small territories of intimacy that existed nowhere else in our lives. His knee pressed against mine with the casual certainty of ownership. My shoulder served as his pillow during early morning rides when sleep still clung to both of us. His sketchbook rested against my thigh while he drew, turning my leg into an easel for his observations. These touches had accumulated over weeks into something that felt like a relationship, though neither of us had ever used that word or any word to describe what was happening between us. The bus was making its slow progress through residential streets, past houses where people were settling into evening routines behind lit windows. I watched a woman in one kitchen washing dishes while her partner dried them, their movements synchronized in the way that comes from years of shared domesticity. Something about their easy intimacy made my chest tighten with longing for something I had never allowed myself to imagine having. That's when Xavier spoke, his voice cutting through the white noise of rain, an engine with words that landed heavier than the storm outside. "I don't sit here because it's the only seat," he said, not looking at me, but the rain-streaked window where our reflections were superimposed over the darkening street. "I sit here because it's you." The confession hung in the air between us like something physical, changing the atmosphere in our small shared space. I turned to look at him fully for the first time since he had spoken, finding his eyes already waiting for mine. There was no pretense in his expression, no attempt to soften the weight of what he had just said with humor or deflection. Just honest vulnerability offered without guarantee of reciprocation. His eyes were darker than I had realized, flecked with gold that caught what little light filtered through the rain-soaked windows. They held mine with steady intensity, not demanding an answer, but making it clear that he was prepared to wait for whatever response I could manage. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of wheels on wet pavement and the distant murmur of other passengers' conversations. I had spent weeks trying to convince myself that what was growing between us existed within the safe boundaries of friendship, that the attention he paid to me and the care with which he curated our shared experiences could be explained by simple human kindness. But sitting there in the dim light of that nearly empty bus, looking into eyes that saw me more clearly than I had ever allowed myself to be seen, the fiction I had constructed crumbled entirely. This was not friendship. This was recognition of the deepest kind, the acknowledgement that two people could find in each other something they hadn't known they were looking for. It was Xavier choosing me not once, but repeatedly, every morning for weeks, making himself vulnerable to the possibility of rejection with each decision to sit beside me instead of anywhere else on that bus. I felt my hand move before I consciously decided to move it, reaching across the small space between us until my fingers found his where they rested on his thigh. His skin was warm beneath mine, solid and real in a way that made everything else feel suddenly more vivid. The contact sent electricity up my arm and straight to my chest, where it settled as a certainty I could no longer deny or rationalize away. The revelation wasn't in his words, though they had been the catalyst. It was in the way my body responded to his honesty, the way my heart had been preparing for this moment through all those weeks of shared music and careful touches. It was in recognizing that I had been choosing him too, even when I told myself our connection was accidental. Every morning, I had arrived at the bus stop hoping to see him. Every playlist I had shared had been chosen with him in mind. Every moment of contact I had treasured instead of explaining away. Neither of us moved our hands. His thumb traced a gentle arc across my knuckles, a touch so soft it might have been accidental, if not for the deliberate way he repeated it. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, creating a cocoon of privacy around us, even in public space. The bus was approaching my stop, the familiar landmarks appearing through rain-distorted glass. But for the first time since I've been riding this route, I didn't want the journey to end. I wanted to stay suspended in this moment of recognition, in the space between his confession and whatever would come next. When I finally spoke, my voice came out quieter than I intended, barely audible over the sound of the storm. "I know," I said, and felt the truth of it resonate through my entire body. "I know." The morning after Xavier's confession, I woke with the strange sensation that the world had shifted on its axis overnight. Everything in my apartment looked exactly as I'd left it. The stack of textbooks on my desk, the coffee mug I'd forgotten to wash, the laundry I'd been meaning to fold for 3 days, but it all felt different somehow, charged with possibility in a way that made my movements feel deliberate and significant. I stood at my window longer than usual, coffee growing cold in my hands as I watched the street below with new attention. Every person who passed might be Xavier walking to the bus stop. Every sound might be his footsteps on pavement still damp from the previous night's rain. The anticipation was almost unbearable, made more intense by the knowledge that whatever happened during our ride that morning would determine the shape of everything that came after. When I finally made my way to the bus stop, my heart was beating in rhythms that seemed too quick and too loud. The small crowd of waiting students looked different to me now, like extras in a scene that was really about something else entirely. I found myself scanning faces with nervous energy, looking for Xavier among the familiar strangers who shared our daily routine. The bus arrived on schedule, its doors opening with the same mechanical wheeze I had been hearing for months. But when I climbed aboard and looked toward our usual seat, Xavier wasn't there. The space that had become ours by virtue of repetition and unspoken agreement was empty, just worn vinyl and the ghost of all the conversations we had shared through music and touch. I stood in the aisle longer than I should have, blocking other passengers while I processed his absence. Maybe he was running late. Maybe he had overslept or missed his alarm or decided to walk to campus instead of taking the bus. There were a dozen reasonable explanations for why he might not be there, but my mind immediately jumped to the one I feared most. That his confession had been a mistake he regretted, that the vulnerability he had shown me in the rain-soaked evening light had felt too exposed in the harsh clarity of morning. I took our usual seat and tried to convince myself that his absence meant nothing. But the empty space beside me felt enormous, a void that seemed to expand with each stop we made without him appearing. I pressed my face against the window, looking for any sign of him on the sidewalks we passed, hoping to catch a glimpse of his familiar figure hurrying to catch up with the bus at the next stop. By the time we reached the main campus loop, I had constructed an entire narrative of regret and retreat in my mind. Xavier had realized that what he felt for me was a mistake, that the connection we had built over weeks of shared music and careful touches wasn't worth the complication of being honest about it. He was probably taking a different bus now, or walking to campus, or had decided to rearrange his entire schedule to avoid the awkwardness of facing me after revealing too much. I walked to my first class in a fog of disappointment that felt disproportionate to the situation. After all, we had never made any promises to each other. We had never even defined what was happening between us beyond that moment of recognition in the rain. I had no right to expect him to be there every morning just because he had been there every morning before. But the logic felt thin against the weight of loss I was carrying. The day passed in slow motion, each hour dragging by with the heavy quality that time takes on when you're waiting for something that might never come. I found myself checking my phone constantly, though I realized I didn't even have Xavier's number. We had built our entire connection within the contained world of the bus, and now that world felt impossibly fragile. When evening came and I boarded the bus with a ride home, I told myself I wasn't looking for him. But my eyes went immediately to our seat, and finding it empty again felt like confirmation of every fear I had been nurturing throughout the day. I sat alone in the space we had shared, surrounded by other passengers who had their own routines and destinations, and small dramas playing out in parallel to mine. That's when the doors opened at the next stop and Xavier burst through them, slightly breathless and grinning with the kind of relief that comes from narrowly avoiding disaster. He had clearly been running, his messenger bag bouncing against his hip as he hurried down the aisle toward me. When he dropped into the seat beside me, his knee pressed against mine with the familiar certainty that made everything else fall back in a proper proportion. "I almost missed it," he said, still catching his breath from whatever sprint had gotten him to the bus just in time. His eyes found mine with an intensity that made it clear he wasn't just talking about transportation. The words carried the weight of everything we hadn't said yet, acknowledgement that missing this moment would have meant missing something much more significant than a bus ride. His hand found mine in the space between our seats, fingers interlacing with the kind of deliberate intention that left no room for misinterpretation. The touch sent warmth up my arm and settled in my chest as certainty, the knowledge that whatever choice we were making it together. I leaned into him then, just enough for the decision to be undeniable to both of us. My shoulder pressed against his, my head finding the natural curve where his neck met his collarbone, and everything about the gesture felt like coming home to something I hadn't known I was looking for. 6 months later, I wake to the sound of Xavier humming in the kitchen of the apartment we now share. The melody is something new, a song I don't recognize, but that carries the same careful attention to beauty that first drew me to him on that crowded bus. Through the thin walls, I can hear him moving around with the quiet consideration he shows for my tendency to sleep later than he does, making coffee for two with the same unconscious generosity he had shown me that first cold morning when he arrived with an extra cup. The morning light streams through windows that face east, casting long rectangles across the wooden floors we spent a weekend refinishing together. Everything about this space carries traces of the careful way we have learned to build a life together. His sketchbooks stacked beside my textbooks, his vinyl records organized next to my collection of books about subjects I will probably never master, the coffee table we found at a thrift store and restored because we both saw potential in things other people had given up on. But some mornings I still take the bus. Not because I need to exactly. We have Xavier's car now, a reliable, if unremarkable sedan that gets us where we need to go with minimal drama. But there are days when the rhythm of wheels on pavement and the gentle sway of public transportation feel necessary, like returning to the place where we first learned how to be together in the same space without needing to explain ourselves to anyone. This is one of those mornings. Xavier understands without me having to ask, the way he has learned to understand most things about me through the patient attention he pays to details other people miss. He hands me my coffee in the travel mug he bought me for my birthday, the one with the chip on the handle that happened during our first week of living together and that we have never bothered to replace because imperfection has become part of its charm. We walk to the bus stop together, past houses where people are beginning their own morning routines behind lit windows. The neighborhood has changed since we started riding this route. New families moving into apartments that have been empty, students graduating and leaving behind rooms that other students now occupy. But the fundamental rhythm remains the same. The gathered crowd of sleepy commuters, the mechanical wheeze of arriving buses, the careful choreography of people claiming seats and settling in for journeys that are simultaneously routine and unpredictable. When our bus arrives, Xavier and I board together, moving down the aisle towards seats that no longer feel like they belong to us exclusively, but still carry the weight of everything we discovered there. We sit side by side, his knee pressed against mine with the same casual certainty that had once felt like such a revelation, his sketchbook balanced across both our laps while he draws whatever catches his attention outside the window. Today he is sketching an elderly couple waiting at a bus stop, their hands clasped together in a way that suggests decades of shared mornings and the comfortable knowledge that someone will always be there to wait with you. His pencil moves across the paper with confident strokes, capturing not just their physical forms, but something about the quality of their attention to each other, the way long partnerships create their own gravity that draws two people into permanent orbit around their shared center. I watch him work, my head resting against his shoulder in a gesture that has become as natural as breathing. The weight of my skull against his collarbone, the rise and fall of his chest as he concentrates on getting the details right, the warmth that radiates from his body into mine. All of it feels like home in a way that has nothing to do with geography and everything to do with recognition. Other passengers board and disembark around us, caught up in their own small dramas and daily necessities. College students with backpacks full of textbooks they may or may not read, office workers staring at phones that contain entire worlds of communication and distraction, elderly people moving with the careful deliberation that comes from understanding that time is finite and worth spending thoughtfully. To all of them, we are probably just two young men sharing a seat on public transportation. Nothing remarkable about the way Xavier's free hand rests on my thigh, or how I occasionally point out details in the landscape that I think he might want to draw, or the easy silence that exists between us even in the midst of the bus's constant motion and noise. They cannot see the invisible threads that connect us to this particular route, this specific ritual of morning travel that transformed two strangers into something more substantial than friendship, more durable than romance, something that feels like the beginning of a life worth living rather than just enduring. When we reach campus, we gather our things with the unhurried movements of people who know they will do this again tomorrow and the day after that, and for as long as the buses run and we need places to go. Xavier closes his sketchbook and slides it into his messenger bag, the same one he carried on that first morning when he chose to sit beside me instead of anywhere else he could have gone. We stand up together, navigate the aisle together, step off onto the sidewalk together. The morning unfolds around us with all its ordinary possibilities, classes to attend, work shifts to complete, small conversations with people who know us as students or employees or neighbors rather than as the specific configuration of love and attention we become when we are together. But I carry the memory of the bus ride with me throughout the day, the knowledge that no matter where else we go or what else we become, we will always have that first recognition of each other, that initial choice to stay close rather than maintain safe distance. And tomorrow morning, Xavier will sit beside me again, because some decisions, once made with enough care and repetition, become as reliable as sunrise, as constant as the route that carries us forward together.